My name is Beatrice Lawrence. I am 29 years old, and the certified letter that erased my future arrived on a mundane Tuesday afternoon. I opened it standing at my kitchen island, expecting a standard quarterly statement from Caldwell and Finch, the firm managing my late grandmother's trust. The trust was designed to disburse a sum of $256,000 on my 30th birthday, which was exactly 4 months away. Instead, I pulled out a single sheet of paper with a very brief message. Notice of final accounting and account closure. Ending balance $0. I read the number twice. The money was gone. Every dollar my grandmother had set aside for me had been drained. According to the transaction history printed at the bottom of the page, the funds had been wired to an external account 3 weeks prior. The authorizing signature belonged to my father. He had stolen $250,000 from his own daughter to bail my older brother out of a divorce settlement. He did it because he knew I would not scream, I would not cause a scene, and I would protect the family name. He was wrong. What I did over the next few weeks did not just freeze the rest of the estate. It dismantled a 35-year marriage and brought an entire Midwestern dynasty to its knees. Welcome to fluffy revenge, where family secrets are dragged into the light and the responsible daughters finally stop paying the bill. Tell me your age in the comments below, and let me know if you have ever been expected to stay quiet to keep the peace. If you have, this story belongs to you. Let me tell you exactly how I audited my own family. I am a financial manager at a wealth management firm in Columbus, Ohio. My days are spent evaluating risk-hunting down discrepancies in corporate ledgers and mitigating exposure. I am trained to look for the leak before the ship sinks. So when I saw that zero balance, I did not drop the paper. I did not dial my parents to demand answers. Emotion is a liability when a ledger fails to balance. I set the letter down, aligned its edges parallel to the marble counter, and shifted into my professional mindset. At 8:01. The next morning, I called the executor firm. A junior associate named Miller answered the phone. I kept my voice perfectly level and requested the wire transfer authorization for the Helen Lawrence Trust. Miller hesitated, his voice tight over the line, and confirmed the account was empty. I asked him who authorized the transfer. He told me Jim Lawrence had presented a durable power of attorney. The breath caught in my throat, but I made no sound. The power of attorney was a dormant piece of paper I had signed 10 years ago, right before a college study abroad trip to London. It was drafted strictly to allow my father to handle a car registration issue while I was overseas. It was supposed to be shredded the day I returned. Instead, my father had kept it in a drawer for a decade, a loaded gun waiting for an occasion to fire. I asked Miller to email me the transfer receipts and ended the call. To understand how a father justifies taking his daughter's inheritance, you have to understand the currency of our Ohio suburb. In our community, reputation is the only asset that matters. The Lawrences have spent 30 years attending the right charity galas, manicuring the right lawns, and maintaining the illusion of a flawless Midwestern dynasty. In that dynasty, the roles were strictly assigned. My older brother Bradley was the heir apparent. He was loud, charismatic, and perpetually failing upward. Whenever Bradley stumbled, the family quietly paved over the potholes so the neighbors would not notice. I was the silent backbone. The daughter who demanded nothing, required no rescues, and was expected to ask for even less. My parents praised my independence, but what they really valued was my lack of needs. Right now, Bradley was in the middle of a messy divorce from his wife, Jessica. Word around town was that Jessica was threatening to drag Bradley's struggling contracting business through a public discovery process in court. My parents were terrified of the scandal. They were terrified of the neighbors talking. I looked at the digital receipt Miller had just emailed me. The sum of $256,000 wired straight out of my future, signed away by my father. They had used my inheritance to silently pave over Bradley's biggest pothole yet. They paid off his ex-wife to keep his failures quiet, and they used my money to do it. My phone vibrated on my desk. It was a text message from my mother, Susan. Sunday pot roast is at 5. Do not be late. Bradley really needs our support right now. I stared at the glowing screen. They expected me to show up, pass the gravy, and absorb a stolen inheritance as my silent contribution to the family name. They assumed I would just take the loss because I had a good job and a quiet disposition. I locked my screen, pulled a fresh legal pad from my drawer, and began drafting an audit. My family thought I was a safety net. They were about to find out I was a steel trap. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' colonial home exactly at 5 o'clock. In our affluent Ohio suburb. Punctuality was just another metric of being put together. Another subtle way to prove your household was functioning perfectly. The lawn was cut into precise diagonal stripes. The hedges were trimmed into sharp, unyielding angles. Everything about the property projected enduring stability. It was the physical embodiment of the Lawrence family brand. I parked my car and sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, letting the engine idle. Inside my leather purse was a folded printed copy of the wire transfer receipt. The piece of paper weighed practically nothing. Yet it felt heavy enough to pull me right through the floorboards. For 10 years, that outdated power of attorney had sat in my father's desk drawer. Now it had been weaponized. I took a slow breath, smoothed the front of my blouse, and walked up the brick path to the front door. I did not knock. I turned the brass knob and stepped into the scent of roasting meat and simmering tension. My mother, Susan, was moving frantically between the kitchen island and the formal dining room table. She wore a pristine beige sweater set and a strand of pearls, her hair sprayed into an immovable blonde helmet. She was arranging silver serving spoons and talking over her shoulder about the upcoming autumn gala at the local country club. She complained at length that the floral committee was going over budget on the table centerpieces. She detailed the exact price difference between hydrangeas and orchids. The irony of her worrying about a few $100s in floral arrangements while my stolen inheritance sat in her husband's bank account was sharp and bitter. She lived her entire life on the surface, meticulously maintaining the veneer of our social standing, while actively ignoring the rot underneath the floorboards. My father, Jim, sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He poured himself a generous glass of red wine and talked loudly over my mother's floral grievances. He was discussing the latest municipal zoning board meeting, projecting the booming voice of a man who believed every room he entered belonged to him by right. He wore a crisp golf polo, and his signature gold watch playing the role of the benevolent patriarch to perfection. He was a man who shook hands with the mayor, sponsored the local Little League teams, and built his entire identity on the perception of his own success. To look at him, you would never suspect he was a man desperate enough to forge his daughter's signature to cover his son's mistakes. And then there was Bradley. My older brother slumped in a chair near the corner of the table, staring at his glowing phone screen. He looked disheveled, sporting a shadow of a beard and a wrinkled button-down shirt. At 32 years old, he still carried the petulant energy of a teenager who had just been denied the keys to the family car. His ongoing divorce from his wife Jessica had dragged on for 6 grueling months. Jessica was a smart, capable woman who had finally tired of Bradley's chronic mismanagement, both in their marriage and in his struggling residential contracting business. Bradley had a habit of underbidding jobs, mismanaging his crews, and leaving unfinished projects in his wake. Whenever creditors called, my father would quietly open his wallet and make the problem disappear, ensuring the Lawrence name remained untarnished in the local business community. I took my assigned seat near the foot of the table. I placed my linen napkin on my lap and simply observed them. In my line of work, we evaluate corporate health by looking past the polished lobby and digging into the raw financial data. Sitting there in the dining room, I applied the same clinical metric to my own bloodline. I stopped seeing a family and started seeing a balance sheet. I evaluated them as if they were a failing enterprise applying for a loan they could never repay. Bradley was a toxic asset. He was a bad investment that continued to bleed capital, yet management refused to cut their losses. My father was the corrupt executive cooking the books to maintain a facade of solvency. He leveraged unauthorized funds to keep the operation afloat, believing his own authority superseded the law. My mother was the public relations department frantically spinning the narrative. She distracted the shareholders with pot roast and country club gossip, pretending the foundation was solid while the supporting beams cracked. And I was the unwitting investor, the silent partner they expected to absorb the catastrophic losses without ever asking to see the ledger. They had conditioned me for this role my entire life. I was the reliable daughter, the one who paid her own way through college, secured a lucrative career in finance, and never asked for a dime. They viewed my independence not as a success to be celebrated, but as a surplus to be harvested. Because I did not demand attention, they assumed I would not demand my money. They mistook my self-sufficiency for endless compliance. My mother carried a heavy ceramic roasting pan to the center of the table. She directed everyone to pass their plates. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation remained stubbornly trivial. We discussed the unseasonably warm October weather. We discussed my father's recent golf handicap. No one asked how my job was going. No one mentioned my upcoming 30th birthday, the specific date my trust was supposed to mature and disperse my funds. I chewed my food methodically, tasting nothing, waiting for the inevitable shift in the conversation. Eventually, the topic drifted to the only thing that actually mattered in that house. Bradley let out a loud, theatrical sigh and dropped his silver fork onto his china plate. The clatter echoed in the dining room. "Jessica's lawyer keeps calling my office," Bradley muttered, rubbing his temples as if he carried the weight of the world. "She is trying to claim half the value of the contracting equipment and the work trucks. It is ridiculous. The business is barely breaking even right now. She wants to ruin me just to prove a point." My father waved a hand in the air, dismissing the legal threat with a careless flick of his wrist. "Do not worry about Jessica or her bulldog attorney. They are just blowing smoke to see if we flinch. You just focus on getting your crews to the job sites on Monday morning. Leave the legal maneuvers to the professionals." My mother leaned over and placed a comforting hand on Bradley's shoulder. Her expression softened into a mask of deep maternal martyrdom. She looked at him as if he were a wounded soldier returning from battle, rather than a negligent husband facing the consequences of his own actions. "It is such a terrible shame," she said, her voice dripping with sympathetic honey. She was asking for a ridiculous sum of cash to walk away quietly. It was pure extortion. She knew a public trial would be devastating for the business reputation in town. "But you do not need to lose sleep over it anymore, sweetheart. The family handled it." The family handled it. The words hung in the air above the dinner table, sweet and poisonous. I looked closely at my mother's face. She looked genuinely proud. She looked like a woman who had just solved a minor scheduling conflict rather than a woman whose husband had committed wire fraud to pay off an angry ex-wife. She truly believed they had done a noble thing. I realized in that exact moment what they expected of me. They expected me to check my trust account on my 30th birthday, see the zero balance and stay silent. They expected me to swallow the theft of my entire inheritance as my unspoken duty to the Lawrence name. They believed my fear of disrupting the peace was stronger than my sense of self-preservation. They thought I would value our Sunday dinners more than my own future. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, measured sip. The ice clinked against the crystal side of the glass. The sound felt very loud in the quiet dining room. I set the glass down and placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at my father. I kept my tone as neutral and professional as if I were asking a client to clarify a minor tax deduction on a routine spreadsheet. How exactly was Jessica paid out? The table went dead silent. My mother froze with a serving spoon halfway to her plate. Bradley stopped rubbing his temples and stared at me. My father slowly lowered his wine glass, his booming confidence evaporating in an instant. The stifling, polite reality of our Midwestern family gathering shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The war had officially begun. The silence at the table stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. My father stared at me, the deep burgundy of his wine mirroring the sudden flush creeping up his thick neck. My mother looked back and forth between us, her silver serving spoon hovering in midair. Bradley just blinked, slow and uncomprehending. Nobody offered an answer. I did not demand one. I stood up from my chair, folded my linen napkin, and placed it neatly beside my untouched plate. I thanked my mother for the meal, picked up my leather purse, and walked out the front door. I did not wait for the inevitable chorus of excuses. I already had my answer. They assumed my silence meant compliance. I drove back to my townhouse in the dark, the rhythm of the highway providing a steady metronome for my thoughts. When I walked through my front door, I did not pour a glass of wine or turn on the television. I went straight to my home office, booted up my computer, and brewed a pot of black coffee. If my parents wanted to treat my inheritance like a corporate slush fund, I would treat them like a hostile entity undergoing a forensic audit. I started with the public records. In my profession, you learn quickly that people lie, but paper leaves a trail. I logged into the county court database and pulled the docket for Bradley's divorce proceedings. For 6 months, the case had been a bitter gridlock. Jessica's attorney had filed multiple motions demanding a full valuation of Bradley's residential contracting business. She wanted half the value of his work trucks, his equipment, and his pending contracts. Then magically, the entire legal battle evaporated. According to the court filings on October 16th, a mere 2 days after the wire transfer drained my trust, Jessica withdrew her petition for the business valuation. The docket showed a sudden stipulated agreement. A swift cash settlement had been reached outside of court. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and connected the dots. Jessica received a fast, untraceable lump sum. In exchange, Bradley got to keep his failing business out of the public eye. My father had orchestrated the entire transaction to ensure the Lawrence name never appeared in a local courtroom during a messy discovery phase. He bought his son's reputation using his daughter's future. Before closing the court portal, I expanded my search to the county property registry. I cross-referenced the deed to Bradley's suburban home, the one he had shared with Jessica. The records showed a fresh quitclaim deed filed just last week. Jessica had relinquished her rights to the marital home in exchange for the liquid cash, leaving Bradley with full ownership of the property. I ran a soft credit check using the investigative tools available through my firm, looking at the recent financial activity linked to my father's residential address. Jim Lawrence had not taken out any new mortgages, home equity lines of credit, or personal loans to fund this sudden payout. His own credit remained completely untouched. He had chosen the path of least resistance, draining my assets rather than leveraging his own. Next, I turned my attention to the exact mechanism of the theft. I opened the PDF file the junior executor had emailed me that morning. I zoomed in on the scanned image of the durable power of attorney. It was the exact form I had signed 10 years ago in our family kitchen, just days before I flew to London for my study abroad program. I scrutinized the digital document, hunting for the discrepancy. It did not take long to find it. The original document was intended to grant my father temporary authority over a minor vehicle registration issue. But the scanned copy in my possession showed clear signs of manipulation. The specific paragraph limiting the scope and duration of his authority had been carefully whited out and photocopied over. He had altered the dates, shifting a decade-old emergency authorization into a current broad-spectrum mandate. He presented this doctored paperwork to a junior associate at the estate firm, relying on his booming voice and his intimidating Midwestern patriarch persona to push the transaction through without proper scrutiny. The executor failed to verify the document, and my father walked away with my money. I printed the altered power of attorney. The laser printer hummed in the quiet room, spitting out the physical evidence of my father's fraud. I placed the warm sheet of paper onto my desk. I should have felt devastated. I should have felt a profound sense of betrayal. Instead, I felt an icy, calculating clarity. This was not a sudden lapse in judgment on my parents' part. It was the logical conclusion of my entire upbringing. I grew up in a culture where traditional gender roles were not just encouraged, they were rigidly enforced. In our conservative social circle, a son represented the family legacy. A son's failures were treated as temporary setbacks requiring immediate, unconditional bailouts. A daughter, however, was expected to be low maintenance. We were raised to be capable, agreeable, and above all silent regarding our own needs. My parents defined family loyalty as a one-way street. It meant protecting the men of the house at the direct expense of the women. Every time Bradley crashed a car, failed a college course, or bounced a check, my father opened his wallet. Every time I earned a scholarship, secured a promotion, or solved my own problems, I received a polite nod. I was conditioned to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness. I was taught that my value to the family was directly proportional to how little I cost them. They loved my independence only because it subsidized my brother's incompetence. I pulled a manila folder from my supply drawer. I did not call my mother to scream into the phone. I did not send an emotional text message to the family group chat demanding an apology. Apologies are worthless currency. I only deal in restitution. I began compiling the evidence. I slipped the wire transfer receipt into the folder. I added the county court records detailing Jessica's suspiciously timed cash settlement. I placed the printed copy of the forged power of attorney on top. Each piece of paper was a tangible brick in the case I was building against them. Then I opened a blank spreadsheet on my computer monitor. For 10 years, I had managed other people's wealth, ensuring their portfolios grew securely. Tonight, I was managing my own deficit. I created a pristine, unarguable ledger. In the first column, I listed the initial principal of my grandmother's trust. In the second column, I logged the exact amount my father had stolen. I added a row calculating the daily accrued interest they now owed me. I transformed a deep, agonizing personal betrayal into cold, irrefutable data. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about keeping up appearances at the country club, and numbers do not protect the golden child. I stared at the glowing spreadsheet, watching the cursor blink in the final cell. My parents thought they could treat me like a silent partner in their reputation management scheme. They thought I would value the illusion of our perfect family more than I valued my own financial security. They had underestimated the very skills they had forced me to develop. By raising a daughter who never needed their help, they had created a woman who did not fear their disapproval. I saved the document and closed my laptop. I placed the thick manila folder in the center of my desk. The evidence was secured. The audit was complete. It was time to schedule a meeting. I picked up my phone and drafted a brief formal email to my parents requesting their presence at my downtown office the following morning. I did not mention the pot roast. I did not mention the divorce. I simply told them we needed to discuss the Helen Lawrence Trust. My downtown office sits on the 14th floor of a glass and steel high-rise. It is a sterile environment constructed of chrome-frosted glass and polished concrete. The air conditioning hums at a constant 68 degrees. It is the exact opposite of my parents' warm, wallpapered dining room, which is precisely why I chose it. When confronting a hostile entity, you never fight on their turf. You bring them into a space where your authority is the only functioning metric. At exactly 9 the next morning, my assistant escorted Jim and Susan Lawrence into the main conference room. They walked in carrying gourmet coffees, looking entirely too relaxed. My mother wore a pastel trench coat and pearl earrings. My father sported a tailored suit without a tie, projecting the casual confidence of a man who owned the city. I knew exactly what they expected. Over the years, whenever Bradley required a bailout that involved actual paperwork rather than just a written check, my father would schedule these impromptu meetings. They assumed I had summoned them to help untangle my brother's remaining tax liabilities, or perhaps to ask if I could co-sign a bridge loan for his failing contracting firm. I sat at the head of the long oak table, dressed in a charcoal blazer. I did not offer them coffee. I did not stand to greet them. I simply pushed the thick manila folder across the smooth surface of the wood. It came to a stop directly in front of my father. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as a dial tone. "Open it." My father chuckled, a patronizing sound that usually preceded a lecture on how the real world worked. He flipped the cover open. His eyes tracked down the first page. It was the wire transfer receipt from Caldwell and Finch. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He quickly turned to the second page, then the third, finding the altered power of attorney and the county court records detailing Jessica's settlement. The silence in the conference room stretched out, heavy and thick. My mother leaned over his shoulder to look. She saw the zeros. She saw the signature. Instead of expressing shock or horror at her husband's forgery, she straightened her posture and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. She treated the discovery of a stolen $250,000 as if I had brought up an impolite subject at a dinner party. "Beatrice, she sighed, adjusting her silk scarf. "You need to understand the position we were in. Bradley was going to lose the business in the divorce. Jessica was demanding an extortionate amount of money to walk away quietly. I watched her spin the narrative, fascinated by her ability to normalize grand theft. In her mind, the ultimate sin was not stealing from her daughter. The ultimate sin was public embarrassment. Everyone in town would have known. She continued, her voice gaining momentum. If they went to trial, his financial records would have become public. The country club board, the church elders, the municipal zoning committee. Everyone would have seen that he was failing. We saved the family reputation. We did what we had to do to protect your brother. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked at the woman who birthed me and realized she truly believed her own defense. She thought protecting the Lawrence legacy justified liquidating my future. The psychological condition of our conservative Ohio suburb ran so deep that she could not separate morality from social standing. She expected me to agree. She expected me to nod, fold the papers, and pretend the theft was a noble sacrifice. My father recovered from his initial shock. He closed the folder, slid it back toward me, and leaned back in his leather chair. He adopted the tone of a disappointed manager dealing with a sensitive employee. "You are being incredibly dramatic about this, Beatrice," he said. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I moved some assets around to solve a temporary liquidity issue. It was a business decision. You have a fantastic job here. You earn a great salary. You did not even need that money right now anyway." I stared at him. He had just admitted to forging my signature to drain my grandmother's trust, and he was framing it as a pragmatic accounting maneuver. He referred to my inheritance as assets he had the right to move. He expected me to play my assigned role. He expected the silent, responsible daughter to absorb the loss and thank him for keeping the family intact. He believed my financial stability justified his theft. Because I had worked hard to build a secure life, he felt entitled to dismantle it to cushion Bradley's fall. "You committed fraud," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his. "You altered a legal document and stole $256,000 from my trust account." My father bristled, his face reddening again. He hated the word stolen. He preferred softer terms, words that obscured his accountability. In his mind, he was the benevolent patriarch steering the ship through a storm. He could not comprehend a reality where his daughter held him liable for piracy. "We are a family," he snapped, leaning forward and planting his hands on the table. "And family handles family. We take care of our own when things get difficult. You should be proud we were able to keep this quiet. We kept your brother out of a public courtroom." I held his gaze. I did not blink. "Family does not commit wire fraud," I replied. The words hung in the sterile air of the conference room. My mother gasped softly, clutching her purse. My father's jaw tightened. I opened my laptop and woke the screen, signaling that the negotiation portion of our meeting, which had never actually existed, was over. "You have exactly 72 hours to return the full amount to the trust account," I told them. "If the funds are not replaced by close of business on Friday, I will take formal legal action. I will hand this folder over to the authorities, and I will let the probate court unravel the rest." My parents stared at me, genuinely stunned. They had never heard me issue an ultimatum. They had spent 29 years testing my boundaries and finding them infinitely flexible. They assumed my quiet demeanor meant I lacked a spine. They failed to realize that silence is also the sound a predator makes before it strikes. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished concrete floor. He buttoned his suit jacket, reclaiming his patriarchal armor. "You are bluffing," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are not going to drag your own family into court over a misunderstanding. You know what that would do to your mother. You know what that would do to our standing in this community." He walked toward the door, not looking back. "Call me when you calm down and remember who you are," he added over his shoulder. He marched out of the glass doors. My mother followed close behind him, casting one last disappointed look at me, as if I had just ruined a holiday gathering. They walked into the elevator bank, certain I would back down. They believed the Ohio conditioning was too deep. They thought my fear of social ruin would override my desire for justice. They went home thinking the storm had passed. They had no idea I was about to freeze the entire ocean. 72 hours is a generous window to rectify an unauthorized withdrawal. I spent Wednesday and Thursday monitoring my personal banking portals, checking for pending incoming transfers. The wire feed remained stubbornly empty. My father did not call to negotiate. My mother did not text to offer excuses. In their minds, the confrontation in my office was merely a temper tantrum that would inevitably fizzle out under the crushing weight of social expectations. They played the waiting game, assuming my lifelong Midwestern conditioning would kick in. They expected me to retreat to swallow the financial loss and to eventually apologize for making a fuss that disturbed the family peace. I did not apologize. At exactly 5 o'clock on Friday evening, the deadline expired. The grace period was over. On Monday morning, I sat across a mahogany desk from Thomas Wright, a senior litigator specializing in probate and estate disputes. Thomas was not a man who cared about country club invites, local zoning board prestige, or the supposed sanctity of a prominent surname. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who saw trusts and estates not as untouchable family legacies, but as rigid legal contracts bound by strict fiduciary statutes. I handed him my meticulously organized manila folder. He reviewed the altered power of attorney, the bank transfer receipts, and the divorce settlement dockets. He did not offer emotional sympathy or platitudes about how hard family rifts can be. He offered a clinical, devastating strategy. My grandmother Helen had structured her estate with rigorous multi-generational oversight. While my specific portion was slated for a lump sum disbursement upon my 30th birthday, the bulk of her wealth was tied up in a broader family trust. This larger financial vehicle held my parents' inheritance, including lucrative commercial real estate deeds and mutual funds designed to pay out in staggered quarterly dividends over the next 5 years. My father relied heavily on those quarterly dividends to maintain his affluent lifestyle fund, his social obligations, and cover the mounting overhead of his own opaque business ventures. He treated the Helen Lawrence Trust as his personal safety net. I instructed Thomas to file an ex parte emergency injunction against the entire trust. We alleged a direct breach of fiduciary duty, citing the forged authorization and the unauthorized diversion of funds, because my father acted as a de facto trustee. When he presented the altered document to the executor, his theft compromised the integrity of the entire estate. The legal maneuver was precise and surgical. We petitioned the probate court to freeze every single asset connected to the trust, halting all distributions pending a full forensic investigation by a court-appointed auditor. This is the true beauty of financial law. It removes the unpredictable, messy human element. You do not have to argue with a stubborn patriarch who refuses to listen. You do not have to endure a mother pleading about the neighbors talking or crying about family loyalty. You simply file the correct paperwork, and the heavy, unfeeling machinery of the judicial system takes over. On Wednesday morning, a probate judge reviewed the irrefutable documentary evidence of the altered signature and the mismatched wire destination. The proof was stark and indisputable. By Wednesday afternoon, the judge signed the restraining order. The court mandated a total asset freeze, a legal mechanism swung into motion entirely blind to my parents' elevated social standing. Court orders were digitally transmitted to the regional banking institutions, the investment brokerages, and the county property clerks. The automated banking system executed the commands without hesitation. Brokerage accounts were locked. Lines of credit secured by trust assets were suspended indefinitely. The scheduled quarterly dividend disbursements were halted in their tracks. I sat at my office desk throughout the week, drinking black coffee and watching the stock market ticker on my secondary monitor. I felt a profound sense of tranquility. The consequences were entirely systemic. I did not have to lift another finger or engage in a single shouting match. I did not have to yell, threaten, or cajole my parents into doing the right thing. The cold algorithms of the American banking sector were fighting my battle for me. When a bank receives a court-ordered freeze, there is no branch manager to charm. There is no board member my father could take to the golf course to smooth things over with a handshake and a round of drinks. The vaults simply close and the electronic gates lock. For decades, my family operated on a localized currency of favors, intimidation, and maintaining pristine appearances. If a supplier demanded overdue payment from Bradley, My father would leverage his local influence, perhaps offering a prime introduction to a city councilman in exchange for leniency. My mother would smooth over social indiscretions by hosting lavish charity luncheons and flattering the right wives. They controlled their environment through sheer social gravity. But social gravity holds zero weight inside a federal banking server. A frozen account does not care who you play tennis with. By Friday afternoon, the gears of the freeze finally caught up to the reality of my parents' daily lives. I was reviewing a quarterly earnings report for a corporate client when my cell phone vibrated on my polished concrete desk. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let the call go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Then a third time. Then a text message arrived. The message was frantic, lacking her usual impeccable grammar and composed tone. It read, "Beatrice, answer your phone right now. Something is wrong with the bank." I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. I watched the notification bubbles multiply as more messages flooded in. I imagined the exact scenario unfolding in her pristine suburban world. It was the first Friday of the month. In the Lawrence household, this was the specific day the automatic drafts processed for their most vital social memberships and obligations. The premium tier health insurance, the lease payments on my mother's luxury SUV, the highly coveted country club dues. Another text came through. The country club just called me. Our automatic payment was declined. Jim is standing at the teller window at the bank, and his card was denied. They are telling him his accounts are locked. What did you do? The carefully curated facade was cracking wide open. The financial oxygen they used to inflate their flawless image had been abruptly cut off. A bounced check at the local country club was not just a minor administrative error in their elite social circle. It was a catastrophic failure of status. The whispers in the clubhouse dining room would start long before the evening dinner service began. The rumors would spread through the golf course and the tennis courts by Saturday morning. The very public humiliation they had stolen my inheritance to avoid was now arriving directly at their own front door, brought on by their own staggering hubris. I placed my phone face down on my desk. The screen continued to vibrate against the hard surface, rattling like a trapped insect in a jar. They were realizing that the quiet, responsible daughter had not backed down. They were discovering that I held the keys to their entire kingdom, and I had just changed the locks. My phone buzzed one more time, illuminating a new message from Bradley. The panic was no longer contained to my parents. The shockwave was spreading outward. The device danced across the smooth concrete surface of my office desk, emitting a relentless mechanical hum. The notifications had migrated from individual panic to a coordinated digital assault. The screen illuminated with the title of our designated text thread, simply labeled Lawrence Family. For years, this specific group chat served as the digital scrapbook of our flawless Midwestern existence. It was normally a repository for photos of my mother's immaculate rose garden, updates on my father's golf handicap, and my brother's complaints about unreliable subcontractors. I traditionally existed as a silent participant in that space, offering brief acknowledgements, or a polite thumbs-up icon to confirm I was still alive. Today, the digital space had transformed into a war zone. My brother initiated the barrage. Bradley typed exclusively in capital letters, projecting a frantic desperation that radiated through the screen. He demanded to know why his corporate purchasing card had just declined at the regional lumber yard. He stood at a commercial checkout counter surrounded by local vendors and fellow contractors, enduring the profound humiliation of insufficient funds. The text messages revealed a crucial structural detail about his failing enterprise. Bradley did not merely receive a cash bailout for his divorce settlement. His daily business survival was intrinsically tied to the family estate. His contracting firm operated on a revolving line of credit secured by the commercial real estate deeds held within the Helen Lawrence Trust. By petitioning the probate court to freeze the trust, I had inadvertently severed his commercial lifeline. The bank suspended his credit instantly. He accused me of destroying his livelihood, typing frantic misspelled sentences demanding I call the bank and fix my mistake. He framed his own financial ruin as a direct consequence of my cruelty, entirely ignoring the reality that his solvency was propped up by stolen money. Before I could process his outburst, the blue bubbles indicating a new message appeared on the screen. My mother entered the fray. Susan did not use capital letters or aggressive punctuation. Her weapon of choice was profound, suffocating guilt. Her messages arrived as impenetrable walls of text, each paragraph carefully constructed to inflict maximum emotional damage. She detailed the immediate fallout at the country club, describing the pitying looks they received from the clubhouse manager when their automatic draft failed. In our Ohio suburb, public pity is far more lethal than public anger. She quickly pivoted from social embarrassment to medical emergencies, a classic tactic she had employed since my childhood. Whenever a family argument did not resolve in her favor, Susan would manifest a sudden mysterious ailment to force a ceasefire. Now she weaponized my father's health. She claimed Jim was experiencing severe chest pains and erratic blood pressure due to the stress of my betrayal. She painted a portrait of a crumbling, benevolent patriarch brought to his knees by an ungrateful daughter. She accused me of trying to give him a heart attack over a simple administrative misunderstanding. She begged me to think of the family reputation warning that the entire town would soon know our private business. She insisted that destroying my own father over money was a stain I would never be able to wash away. She demanded I drop the injunction immediately, so they could handle the dispute privately inside the walls of their home, where their authority remained unquestioned. A few minutes later, the typing indicator bubbled again. My father delivered his response. Jim did not plead, and he did not employ guilt. He relied on the only tool he respected: absolute patriarchal command. His message was a terse, definitive directive. He ordered me to contact my attorney and reverse this ridiculous tantrum before the close of business. He refused to acknowledge the freezing of his assets as a legitimate legal consequence. By labeling my court-ordered injunction a tantrum, he attempted to diminish a federal banking mandate into a childish outburst. He commanded me to come to the house on Saturday morning so we could resolve the situation like rational adults. He ended the message with a stark warning that I was crossing a line from which there was no return. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and analyzed the anatomy of a toxic system under extreme duress. A dysfunctional family structure operates much like a combustion engine. It requires a constant source of fuel to keep running. That fuel is emotional reactivity. They needed me to argue. They desperately wanted me to defend my actions, to explain my hurt, or to scream about the injustice of the theft. If I argued, they would have a force to push against. If I defended my choices, I would tacitly acknowledge their authority to question those choices. If I expressed anger, they could easily dismiss me as hysterical and irrational, thereby justifying their own terrible behavior. They expected the quiet, responsible daughter to eventually crack under the sheer weight of their combined disappointment. They assumed the threat of social exile would bring me back into the fold. In my profession, an auditor does not debate a corrupt executive about the morality of embezzlement. An auditor simply presents the findings and lets the regulatory agencies handle the enforcement. I applied this exact methodology to my own bloodline. I deployed a state of mind I call the auditor's calm. I detached my emotions from the ledger. I picked up the device and tapped the screen to compose a reply. I did not address Bradley's public humiliation at the lumber yard. I did not engage with my mother's fabricated medical crisis or her desperate pleas regarding the country club gossip. I certainly did not acknowledge my father's patronizing commands. I typed a single concise sentence: all communications regarding the Helen Lawrence Trust must now go through my legal counsel, Thomas Wright. Here is his office number and email address. I will not be discussing this matter directly. I hit send. The delivery of that professional, emotionless message generated the digital equivalent of a shockwave. For a brief moment, the chat thread remained perfectly still. Then the typing indicators for all three family members flared to life simultaneously. They realized that their primary weapons, guilt, shame, and authority, were entirely useless against a brick wall of legal representation. By refusing to provide the emotional fuel they craved, I starved the engine. The power dynamic shifted permanently in that fraction of a second. I was no longer the subservient daughter asking for an explanation. I was a hostile creditor enforcing a debt. I muted the group chat, silencing the notifications, and placed the phone face down in my desk drawer. The weekend passed in a state of quiet, unbroken peace. The judicial freeze held firm across all banking platforms. My father was left to navigate a sudden, terrifying lack of liquidity without the ability to demand a reversal. My mother was forced to face her country club peers without the shield of unlimited capital, but my brother lacked the discipline to endure the silence. Bradley was accustomed to immediate gratification and rapid bailouts. Being cut off from his funds meant his business vendors were preparing to file liens against his contracting firm. He realized that angry text messages and commanding orders would not penetrate the legal barrier I had constructed. The digital realm had failed him. As Monday morning approached, I knew he would seek a physical confrontation, bringing his desperation directly to my doorstep. Monday evening arrived with the sharp chill characteristic of an Ohio autumn. I packed my briefcase, shut down my dual monitors, and took the elevator down to the subterranean parking garage of my office building. The underground structure was a cavern of gray concrete illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. My heels clicked against the floor in a steady, measured rhythm. I approached my assigned parking space and noticed a figure leaning against the driver's side door of my sedan. It was my older brother. Bradley Lawrence usually carried himself with the effortless grace of a man who knew the world would always catch him. He was accustomed to wearing tailored suits, flashing a charismatic smile, and letting our father handle the heavy lifting of reality. Tonight, the golden child aura had entirely evaporated. He looked frantic. His designer button-down shirt was wrinkled and untucked at the waist. Dark circles bruised the delicate skin under his eyes, and a sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead despite the dropping temperature in the garage. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, looking like a cornered animal rather than the heir to a suburban dynasty. I unlocked the car with my key fob from 10 yards away. The headlights flashed and Bradley snapped in his attention toward me. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us with erratic, desperate steps. I did not alter my pace. I maintained my calm professional stride, stepped around him, and slid into the driver's seat. I engaged the automatic locks immediately. The heavy thud of the security mechanism echoed in the quiet garage. I turned the ignition, letting the engine hum to life, and rolled the window down precisely halfway. It was just enough to hear his voice, but high enough to maintain a physical barrier between us. "Beatrice, you have to stop this right now," Bradley pleaded, wrapping his hands over the top edge of the window glass. His knuckles were white from the strain. "You have to call your lawyer and lift the freeze. My accounts are locked. My business credit cards are declining at the supply houses. I have crews showing up tomorrow morning and I cannot even buy the lumber to keep them working. The vendors are threatening to file liens against my company by the end of the week." I observed him with clinical detachment. For 32 years, Bradley had navigated life using our father's reputation as a shield. Whenever he underbid a contracting job or failed to pay a subcontractor, Jim Lawrence would quietly open a checkbook and make the problem vanish. Bradley never had to face the brutal arithmetic of a balanced ledger. Now, severed from the trust fund that secretly subsidized his failures, he was experiencing the harsh friction of the real world. The banking system did not care about his charming smile or his country club pedigree. The banking system only recognized insufficient funds. "Your business accounts are tied to the commercial properties held within the trust," I stated, keeping my voice level and devoid of sympathy. "The trust is currently under investigation for fiduciary fraud. The probate court ordered the freeze. I cannot simply call a bank manager and undo a judicial mandate because you need to buy lumber, Bradley." He smacked his palm against the roof of my car. The loud sound reverberated through the concrete structure. "You are doing this on purpose," he accused, his voice rising in pitch and cracking under the strain. "You are trying to ruin me because you are jealous. You have always been jealous that Mom and Dad supported my business instead of treating you like the favorite. You are punishing the entire family over a simple accounting mistake. Dad was going to pay you back." I watched his face contort with misplaced righteous anger. It was fascinating to witness the Lawrence family delusion operating at peak capacity. He genuinely believed that stealing my inheritance was a minor administrative error, a temporary loan justified by his own importance. He viewed my enforcement of boundaries as a spiteful attack on his birthright. In his mind, my financial security was a communal resource always available to be harvested for his benefit. It was not a mistake, I corrected him calmly. It was forgery, and it was theft. You are experiencing the consequences of those actions. I suggest you contact your own attorney and prepare for the audit. Bradley realized that anger and entitlement were failing to penetrate my calm demeanor. He shifted tactics, seamlessly adopting the weapon our mother favored. He tried to induce profound guilt. He leaned closer to the crack in the window, his breath fogging the cool glass. Do you have any idea what you are doing to our parents? He demanded, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. Mom can barely show her face in public. The neighbors are starting to ask questions. And Dad is falling apart. You think you are so smart sitting there in your corporate suit judging all of us. But you do not know the half of it. Do you know what Dad is dealing with? You think the $256,000 was just for Jessica? Dad's margins are wiped out. The garage seemed to grow impossibly quiet. The hum of my car engine faded into the background. My analytical mind, honed by years of evaluating financial risks and hunting for hidden liabilities, locked onto that single erratic sentence. You think the money was just for Jessica? I stared at my brother. Bradley was panting, his chest heaving, entirely unaware of the catastrophic data point he had just handed to a forensic accountant. He had intended to use the statement to emphasize our father's immense stress, hoping to evoke my sympathy. Instead, he had inadvertently torn the cover off a much deeper, more systemic rot within our family dynasty. Step away from the vehicle, Bradley, I said. My voice was no longer just professional. It was as sharp as cut glass. He looked at me, confused by my sudden intensity. He slowly pulled his hands back from the window. I pressed the button to raise the glass, sealing him outside. I shifted the car into drive and accelerated toward the exit ramp, leaving him standing alone under the flickering fluorescent lights. I navigated the evening traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel with steady, deliberate force. The streetlights washed over the dashboard, illuminating the interior of my car in rhythmic flashes. I began to run the numbers in my head. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, forming an entirely new picture of the Lawrence family finances. Jessica was a smart woman, but she was realistic. In a suburban divorce involving a struggling residential contracting business, $250,000 in liquid cash was an exorbitant settlement for a quick, quiet exit. It was far too much money for a simple payoff. If Jessica's settlement did not consume the entire balance drained from my trust, a vast sum of capital was missing. Where did the rest of the money go? The narrative my parents had presented was simple. They claimed a desperate need to save Bradley from public embarrassment. It was a convenient smokescreen. They had used my brother's messy divorce as the perfect excuse to justify the theft, knowing I understood their obsession with our local standing. But Bradley's panicked slip of the tongue revealed the terrifying truth. My father's margins were wiped out. The untouchable patriarch of our Midwestern community was bleeding cash. The theft of my inheritance was not a surgical strike to rescue a prodigal son. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to plug a sinking ship. My father was hiding a catastrophic financial failure, and he had used my signature to buy himself time. The betrayal was far more extensive than a sibling rivalry. I needed to see the destination accounts for the remaining funds. I reached for my phone on the passenger seat and dialed my lawyer to draft a new subpoena. The morning after my encounter in the parking garage, I arrived at my office an hour before the rest of the floor. The sun had not yet crested the Columbus skyline, leaving the city in a muted pre-dawn gray. I brewed a cup of black tea, sat at my desk, and drafted a concise email to Thomas Wright. I instructed my probate attorney to file a subpoena for the destination routing numbers attached to the trust wire transfers. I needed the full banking history of the receiving accounts. Thomas replied within 12 minutes. The legal request was filed before the courthouse doors opened to the public. Tracing hidden capital is a delicate procedure. People attempting to obscure their financial footprints often rely on the illusion of complexity. They create layers of transactions, assuming anyone looking will eventually grow tired of digging through the administrative sediment. As a financial manager, digging through sediment is where I thrive. I understand that capital never truly vanishes. It simply changes shape. The subpoenaed banking records arrived via a secure digital portal late Thursday afternoon. I locked my office door, forwarded my desk phone to voicemail, and opened the encrypted file. The digital packet contained hundreds of pages of transactional history, routing numbers, and ledger entries. I bypassed the noise and searched for the specific date my inheritance was drained. October 14th. There it was. A single incoming deposit of $256,000. I followed the chronological flow of the capital over the subsequent 48 hours. The sum did not remain whole. It was immediately fractured. The records showed an outgoing wire of $80,000 transferred to an escrow account held by a local family law firm. I recognized the firm name from Bradley's divorce docket. That was Jessica's settlement. My former sister-in-law had walked away with a quiet, fast payout just as I suspected, but the math left a gaping, glaring deficit. Subtracting $80,000 from the initial stolen amount left exactly $176,000 unaccounted for. I scrolled down the ledger, my eyes tracking the remaining funds. On October 16th, the exact day Jessica signed her settlement agreement, the remaining balance was transferred into a regional business checking account. The account belonged to an entity listed as Oakmont Holdings, LLC. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the Ohio Secretary of State Business Registry. I searched the corporate filings for Oakmont Holdings. The system generated the registration documents in seconds. I clicked on the most recent annual report and scrolled to the listed registered agent and primary managing member, Jim Lawrence. My breath caught in my chest. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the name a second time to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. My father did not just use my trust to save my brother, he used my brother to save himself. I spent the next 3 hours pulling every available public record associated with Oakmont Holdings. The deeper I dug into the corporate structure, the more the illusion of the great Midwestern patriarch unraveled. For decades, my father had cultivated the image of an untouchable real estate magnate. He held court at the country club, dispensing unsolicited business advice to younger men, projecting an aura of endless liquidity. The paper trail told a distinctly different story. Oakmont Holdings was a graveyard of terrible commercial investments. My father had leveraged heavily into a series of suburban strip malls and speculative retail developments that had stalled during the recent economic downturn. The properties were sitting vacant, generating zero revenue while bleeding cash through property taxes, maintenance fees, and high-interest bridge loans. He had refinanced the commercial mortgages twice, stretching his debt-to-income ratio to the breaking point. The LLC was drowning in red ink. Creditors were circling. Foreclosure notices were pending on 2 of the primary assets. Jim Lawrence was on the verge of total bankruptcy. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark office. The true architecture of his crime finally revealed itself. The theft of my inheritance was never a noble, misguided sacrifice to protect the family name from Bradley's divorce. Bradley's messy separation was simply the most convenient smokescreen my father could have ever hoped to find. My father knew my mother would do anything to protect her golden child. Susan possessed a blind, unwavering devotion to keeping Bradley's failures hidden from their social circle. If Jim told her he needed to move trust assets to pay off Jessica and save their son from public ruin, Susan would not ask to see the ledger. She would not demand a breakdown of the legal fees or the settlement figures. She would not agree to the necessity of the transaction and view her husband as a decisive protector. I exploited her maternal bias to authorize the drain. He secured the $256,000 under the guise of the divorce, gave Jessica the $80,000 she demanded, and quietly funneled the remaining $176,000 into his failing shell company to stave off his own creditors. He robbed his daughter to bail out his son, and he skimmed the majority of the proceeds to save himself. The psychological weight of this discovery settled over me like a heavy winter coat. My mother truly had no idea. During the confrontation in my office, Susan had vehemently defended the theft because she genuinely believed every single dollar went towards saving Bradley's business. She had chastised me for being selfish, fully convinced that her husband had executed a painful but necessary family rescue. She was living inside a curated fiction, fiercely defending a man who was lying to her face every morning over breakfast. My father was not just a thief. He was a parasite feeding on his own household. He allowed my mother to berate me. He allowed my brother to endure the humiliation of frozen credit, and he allowed the entire family structure to fracture all to conceal his own profound professional failure. He prized his status in our Ohio suburb over the stability of his own marriage and the well-being of his children. He constructed a reality where his financial incompetence was treated as a closely guarded state secret, while my financial security was treated as a communal resource to be plundered at will. I minimized the banking records and opened a new folder on my desktop. I dragged the LLC registration documents, the ledger showing the split funds, and the property tax defaults into the encrypted space. I was no longer compiling an audit of a simple trust violation. I was assembling the explosive charges required to demolish a 35-year marriage. For my entire life, I had been instructed to prioritize the feelings of the collective over my own individual needs. I was told that keeping the peace was the highest virtue a daughter could possess. My parents built an entire kingdom on this premise that appearances mattered more than truth. Now I held the documentation that proved their kingdom was constructed on a foundation of hidden debt and breathtaking deceit. If I presented this evidence to the probate judge, the court would order a full liquidation of my father's assets to repay the trust. The commercial properties would be seized. The suburban colonial home would be sold. The truth about Oakmont Holdings would become a matter of public record, accessible to every gossiping neighbor and country club board member in their zip code. The social ruin my father had committed wire fraud to avoid would arrive on his doorstep, magnified tenfold by the revelation of his perjury and embezzlement. But the legal consequences were secondary to the emotional detonation. My mother's entire identity was wrapped up in her marriage to a successful, respected man. Discovering that her husband had used her favorite child's crisis to steal from her youngest child, simply to cover up his own incompetence, would shatter her reality. The unified front they had always presented against me would dissolve into bitter, vicious betrayal. I printed the Oakmont Holdings ledger and placed it into my leather briefcase. The November wind rattled the glass of my office window, a harsh reminder of the approaching holidays. In our family, the holidays were mandatory performances of gratitude and unity. I knew my mother would soon attempt to orchestrate a festive gathering, a desperate bid to force everyone back into their assigned roles, pretending the ongoing legal freeze was just a temporary misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with turkey and polite conversation. I decided I would attend. I would sit at their table one last time. But I would not bring a side dish or a bottle of wine. I would bring the ledger. I packed my belongings, turned off the overhead lights, and stepped into the elevator. The conflict had fundamentally evolved. This was no longer a battle between a neglected sibling and a favored son. This was the impending execution of a fraudulent patriarch. The frost settled over the Ohio suburbs by mid-November, turning the manicured lawns crisp and dormant. As the holidays approached, the Lawrence family strategy shifted from outright hostility to performative tradition. My mother, Susan, believed that any conflict could be suffocated under a layer of roasted turkey and heirloom silver. 10 days before Thanksgiving, she sent a long, carefully worded text message. She invited me to the annual dinner, promising that my father had formulated a formal repayment plan. She insisted we could settle the trust dispute in the house as a family without involving the lawyers anymore. I accepted the invitation. I did not accept it because I desired reconciliation. I accepted it because a financial manager always reviews a proposed settlement before officially rejecting it. I needed them to put their delusion on the record. Before leaving my townhouse on Thursday afternoon, I placed a small leather notepad in my purse. I also checked the battery on my smartphone and engaged the voice memo application. The state of Ohio is a one-party consent jurisdiction for recording conversations. As long as I was an active participant in the discussion, I did not need their permission to document every word they said. I slipped the phone into my blazer pocket, ensuring the microphone remained unobstructed. I pulled into their driveway just as the sun began to dip behind the bare oak trees. The exterior of the colonial home looked exactly as it always did, projecting an image of unwavering stability. Inside, however, the air was thick and suffocating. The usual holiday warmth was replaced by a rigid, choreographed tension. Bradley was nowhere to be seen. He was likely nursing his bruised ego at a local sports bar, rather than facing the sister who had severed his credit line. It was just my parents and me. My mother had gone to extraordinary lengths to manufacture normalcy. The dining room table was set with the finest china crystal water goblets and a sprawling centerpiece of autumn foliage. She ushered me into the room with a tight, nervous smile, chatting incessantly about a neighbor's recent landscaping project. She was trying to fill the heavy silence with meaningless suburban trivia. My father sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey with precise, deliberate slices. I wore a cashmere sweater and a forced expression of paternal benevolence. He greeted me with a curt nod, treating me like a difficult client he was obligated to entertain for the evening. We endured the meal in a state of suspended animation. I ate my food methodically, chewing each bite while analyzing the power dynamics at play. I listened to my mother discuss the upcoming charity winter ball, noting how she cleverly avoided mentioning that their country club dues were currently suspended by a probate judge. She was a master architect of denial. She genuinely believed that if we just passed the cranberry sauce and smiled, the legal freezing of the trust would somehow magically thaw by Monday morning. When the dessert plates were finally cleared, my father folded his linen napkin and cleared his throat. This was the moment he had orchestrated. He pushed his chair back slightly, assuming his preferred posture of authority at the head of the table. "Beatrice, your mother and I are glad you decided to come today." Jim began, interlacing his fingers and resting them on the mahogany surface. "The last few weeks have been unnecessarily stressful for everyone. We want to put this unfortunate chapter behind us. We want to move forward and get things back to normal." I remained silent, letting the recording device in my pocket capture the exact cadence of his condescension. "I have drafted a repayment schedule to satisfy the missing funds," he continued, reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table toward me. "I am willing to personally deposit $500 into your account on the first of every month until the balance is resolved. In exchange, you will contact your attorney tomorrow morning and lift the injunction on the estate." I did not reach for the piece of paper. I simply looked at the numbers written in his neat, practiced handwriting. $500 a month. I did the mental arithmetic instantly. $256,000 divided by 500 equals 512 months. Divided by 12, that is 42 years and 8 months. My father was offering me a 42-year repayment plan for money he had stolen in a single afternoon. He would be well past 100 years old before the debt was settled. It was not a settlement. It was an insult disguised as a concession. My mother leaned forward, her eyes wide with desperate pleading. She reached out across the table and touched my wrist. "Please, Beatrice," Susan urged, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "This is a very generous compromise. Your father is trying to make things right for you. If you do not lift that freeze soon, the rumors in town will become unbearable. People are starting to ask questions about why Jim has not been playing golf. You have to accept this deal. You have to help us save the family standing." She looked at me as if I were a villain holding a knife to their throats, rather than the victim of their financial crime. She believed a monthly pittance was a fair trade for my silence. She thought she was negotiating a peace treaty to protect her son and her husband, viewing my financial security as a cheap bargaining chip. I pulled my arm away from her grasp. I looked directly at my father. He sat there looking waiting for me to yield to the pressure of the holiday and the sheer force of his patriarchal presence. He had built his entire defense on the assumption that my mother would badger me into compliance to avoid a scene. "Let me ensure I fully understand this proposal," I said, my voice cutting through the warm, cinnamon-scented air of the dining room. "You want me to accept $500 a month for the next 42 years to replace the capital you forged my signature to obtain." My father stiffened, clearly disliking hearing the actual timeline spoken aloud. "It is a sign of good faith," he countered defensively, his tone sharpening. "It shows I am committed to making you whole over time. It is a practical solution to a family problem." I opened my purse and pulled out my small leather notepad. I flipped to the first page where I had written down the figures from the subpoenaed banking records I reviewed earlier in the week. I looked down at the exact amounts, then back up at the man who thought he could outsmart a professional auditor. "I have a specific question about your liquidity, Jim," I said, dropping the title of Dad for the first time in my life. How exactly are you going to afford a $500 monthly payment when you are currently $176,000 in the red on the commercial properties held by Oakmont Holdings? The transformation was instantaneous and profound. The blood rushed out of my father's face. The confident, benevolent patriarch vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified man staring at a ghost. His jaw went slack. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair until the skin over his knuckles stretched tight and white. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a sound. He realized in that agonizing second that his fortress of lies had just been breached. He knew I had seen the ledger. He knew I had tracked the destination accounts of the wire transfers. My mother looked back and forth between us, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. The name of the shell company meant nothing to her. The massive deficit did not fit into her curated understanding of their affluent lifestyle. "What commercial properties?" Susan asked, her voice wavering. "What is Oakmont Holdings, Jim? What is she talking about?" My father could not look at her. He stared down at his empty dessert plate, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was trapped between the daughter who knew his secret and the wife he had lied to for years. I stood up from the table and smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt. I picked up my purse and looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life prioritizing my brother's comfort over my security. I felt no pity for her shattered illusion. She had demanded I sacrifice my future to protect a lie. Now she would have to live with the truth. "You should ask your husband where the rest of my inheritance actually went, Susan," I said softly, ensuring my tone conveyed no malice, only clinical fact. "Because it did not all go to Jessica." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the folded repayment plan sitting untouched on the mahogany table. I opened the front door, stepped out into the crisp November night, and walked to my car. The recording device in my pocket had captured everything I needed for the probate judge. The family structure was officially fractured, and I was not going to stick around to witness the collapse. The Monday following Thanksgiving arrived with a bitter wind that stripped the remaining dead leaves from the oak trees outside my office window. I sat at my polished concrete desk reviewing a corporate risk assessment for a client, while a different kind of audit reached its final stage across town. Thomas Wright did not waste time. Over the holiday weekend, his paralegals finalized the formal subpoena for the full business banking records of Oakmont Holdings. In civil litigation, the method of delivery is often as strategic as the document itself. Thomas arranged for a private process server to deliver the subpoena directly to my parents' residential address at 10 o'clock in the morning. He knew my father spent his Monday mornings at the local country club, desperately trying to maintain his social routine despite his frozen credit line. That meant my mother would be home alone to answer the door. For 35 years, Susan Lawrence had insulated herself from the harsh mechanics of finance. She viewed money as an abstract force that simply existed to fund her charity luncheons, her luxury vehicles, and her flawless suburban image. She never looked at a ledger. She signed joint tax returns without reading the schedules. She trusted my father to handle the machinery in the basement while she decorated the living room. When the doorbell rang, she likely expected a package delivery. Instead, a stranger handed her a thick manila envelope bearing the imposing seal of a downtown litigation firm. I can picture her standing in the foyer, adjusting her reading glasses and breaking the seal. She assumed it was merely another round of probate paperwork regarding my supposedly ungrateful behavior. She expected to see a dispute over the $256,000 she believed went directly to Bradley's divorce settlement. What she saw instead was the unvarnished truth. Thomas had attached a preliminary forensic trace as an exhibit to justify the demand for the shell company records. The pages detailed a grim, undeniable reality. Susan read the name Oakmont Holdings. She saw the chronological breakdown of the stolen inheritance. $80,000 routed to a family law firm. $176,000 diverted to an obscure commercial checking account. The exhibit did not stop there. To establish the motive for the fiduciary breach, Thomas included copies of the public default notices tied to the LLC. Susan found herself staring at impending foreclosures on strip malls she never knew her husband owned. She saw exorbitant bridge loans with ballooning interest rates. She saw the raw, terrifying proof that her husband was secretly bankrupt. At 11:15, my cell phone illuminated on my desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I did not pick up. I let the device vibrate until the call rolled over to voicemail. 10 minutes later, the screen lit up again. Over the next hour, she called 6 times. I waited until my lunch break, closed my office door, and played the messages on speakerphone. The progression of her voice across the 6 recordings painted a vivid portrait of a psychological collapse. The first voicemail was laced with confusion and mild irritation. She asked why my lawyer was sending her documents about commercial real estate. The second voicemail sounded breathless. She had reached the page detailing the split funds. By the fourth recording, the illusion of her pristine Midwestern life had fully shattered. "Beatrice, I am looking at a document from your attorney." Her voice trembled through the speaker, stripped of all its usual country club polish. "It says your father owes hundreds of thousands of dollars on properties I do not recognize. It says he put your money into a business checking account. Please pick up the phone. Tell me this is a scare tactic from your lawyer. Tell me these numbers are not real." She was not demanding that I drop the lawsuit. She was not accusing me of embarrassing the family. She was begging me to restore the fiction she had lived inside for 3 decades. The tragedy of Susan Lawrence was that she had traded her independence, her agency, and her relationship with her daughter for the safety of my father's prestige. Now she held undeniable proof that the prestige was a parasite. I did not return her phone call. Engaging in a vocal conversation would only invite emotional manipulation and desperate bargaining. I opened a new email draft and addressed it to her primary account. I kept my response cold, factual, and brief. "Susan, the figures listed in the subpoena exhibit are exact. Forensic accounting traced the missing $176,000 directly from my trust into a shell company Jim created to mask his commercial real estate defaults. The records are public. The debt is real." I clicked send and leaned back in my chair. The Midwestern obsession with reputation is a fragile ecosystem. It relies solely on a collective agreement to ignore the truth in favor of appearances. When undeniable facts are introduced into that ecosystem, it begins to eat itself alive. I knew exactly what would happen when my father returned home that evening. The unified front that had oppressed me for my entire life was permanently broken. For years, they had operated as an impenetrable alliance aligned in their mission to protect Bradley and project perfection. Now they were 2 drowning people fighting over a single life raft. Susan would confront him with the subpoena. She would demand answers about the shell company, the defaults, and the money he had stolen under the guise of saving their son. Jim would attempt to deploy his usual tactics. He would raise his voice, assert his patriarchal authority, and try to gaslight her into believing she did not understand complex business maneuvers. But a ledger is immune to gaslighting. Susan held the paper trail in her hands. She would realize that Jim had allowed her to berate me, allowed her to defend his theft, and allowed her to risk her own social standing, all to cover up his profound financial incompetence. He had made her a clown in her own social circle. In our affluent suburb, a husband losing his wealth is a tragedy, but a husband making a fool of his wife is an unforgivable betrayal. Their 35-year marriage would not survive the night. The anger and resentment that had been quietly building beneath their polished surface would finally erupt untethered by the need to put on a show for their daughter. I had removed myself from the equation, leaving them with no common enemy to unite against. They were finally forced to face each other, stripped of their wealth and their lies. By fracturing their alliance, I had destroyed my father's primary line of defense. Without Susan blindly supporting his narrative, his claim that the trust was drained out of strict familial necessity was severely weakened. However, I knew Jim Lawrence was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are dangerous. He would still face a deposition, and he would still attempt to lie under oath. He would likely try to claim that the shell company was merely a pass-through entity, used to pay Bradley's exorbitant legal fees. He would insist that every cent of the $256,000 eventually made its way to Jessica or her attorneys, despite the forensic evidence suggesting otherwise. He would rely on the court's hesitation to punish a father trying to rescue his son from a vicious divorce, to permanently sever his final escape route. I needed an airtight alibi. I needed to lock down the exact parameters of the divorce settlement from the only other person who knew the truth about the transaction. I needed to speak to the woman who walked away with the $80,000. I pulled up my contacts and searched for Jessica's phone number. It was time to invite my former sister-in-law for a cup of coffee. I selected a quiet, independent coffee shop on the northern edge of Columbus, a full 30 miles away from the manicured lawns and watchful eyes of our suburb. When you are preparing to dismantle a local dynasty, you do not conduct your interviews where the country club wives buy their morning lattes. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a black tea, and chose a booth in the far corner facing the door. Jessica walked in precisely on time. My former sister-in-law always possessed a sharp, practical edge that sharply contrasted with the soft pastel aesthetic my mother favored. Jessica was a licensed architect who married my brother, believing his charming exterior indicated a solid foundation. She spent 5 years learning that Bradley was nothing more than a hollow facade propped up by our father. Today, she wore a tailored gray blazer and dark denim, her expression guarded but curious. We had never been close. The Lawrence family dynamic required everyone to orbit around the men, leaving very little room for the women to build genuine alliances. She slid into the booth across from me and placed a thick leather tote bag on the table. She did not order a drink. She just looked at me with a mixture of weariness and lingering resentment. When you called, you said you needed to verify some financial discrepancies regarding the divorce, Jessica said, keeping her tone strictly professional. I am going to be honest with you, Beatrice. I signed an agreement. I am legally barred from discussing the internal valuation of Bradley's business. I just want to move on with my life. I am not interested in Bradley's business, I replied, keeping my voice low and steady over the ambient hum of the espresso machine. I know the contracting firm is failing. I know he underbids his projects and mismanages his crews. I am interested in how your settlement was funded, because the money you received last month did not come from Bradley and it did not come from my father. It came from my grandmother's trust. Jessica stared at me, her guarded expression slipping into genuine surprise. She leaned back against the vinyl booth. She processed the information quickly, her mind working through the timeline of her own chaotic separation. Jim told me he liquidated his personal retirement accounts to pay me off, she said softly. The sentence hung in the air between us. It was a revelation that perfectly encapsulated my father's specific brand of psychological manipulation. He did not merely commit a financial crime. He weaponized his theft to cast himself as the ultimate martyr. I asked Jessica to walk me through the final weeks of the divorce negotiations. I needed to understand the exact sequence of events that led to the rushed cash settlement. Jessica let out a bitter, exhausted sigh and folded her hands on the table. She explained that she had finally cornered Bradley in late September. Her attorney filed a motion to force a forensic valuation of the contracting company. She knew Bradley was hiding debt, and she was prepared to drag his ledgers into a public courtroom to ensure she received a fair division of their marital assets. Your parents panicked, Jessica explained, her voice tinged with a residual anger. Your mother called me crying, begging me not to ruin the family name in open court. She said a public trial would destroy their reputation in the suburb. Then your father stepped in. He invited me to his office for a private meeting without the lawyers. According to Jessica, Jim Lawrence played the role of the benevolent, weary patriarch to absolute perfection. He sat her down and delivered a somber speech about the tragic reality of failed marriages. He admitted that Bradley was struggling. He then presented her with a low-ball cash offer of $80,000 available immediately via wire transfer provided. She signed a strict non-disclosure agreement and walk away from the business valuation. $80,000 was less than half of what I was entitled to if we sold the equipment and the trucks. Jessica noted, her eyes narrowing at the memory. But I was so tired, Beatrice. I was tired of fighting your family. I was tired of the gaslighting. I just wanted out. And Jim knew that. She paused, taking a slow breath before delivering the final crucial detail. He looked me dead in the eye, she continued, and told me he was pulling the $80,000 from his own personal retirement savings. He told me it was going to cause a significant hardship for him and Susan, but he was willing to sacrifice his own security to help his son and to give me a clean break. He made me feel guilty for taking the money. He made me thank him. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. My father had stood in my downtown office and told me he transferred my trust assets as a simple business decision. He told my mother he moved the money to save their son from ruin. And he told Jessica he was sacrificing his own golden years to grant her freedom. He tailored a bespoke lie for every single woman in his life, manipulating our empathy, our loyalty, and our exhaustion, all to serve his own hidden agenda. He played the savior to his daughter-in-law, the protector to his wife, and the victim to his actual daughter. He harvested gratitude from Jessica while secretly funneling the remaining $176,000 into his failing commercial real estate venture. He orchestrated an elaborate theatrical performance to maintain the illusion of his own wealth and benevolence. "He lied to you," I stated, placing my hands on the cool surface of the table. "He forged an outdated power of attorney and drained my inheritance to secure your payout. He used the remaining funds to cover massive defaults on his own commercial properties. He is bankrupt, Jessica. The entire Lawrence empire is a facade." Jessica closed her eyes. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped her lips. She shook her head, marveling at the sheer audacity of the man who had controlled her life for 5 years. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a pristine manila envelope. She unclasped the metal fastener and slid a stack of legal documents across the table. "This is my finalized settlement agreement," Jessica said. "It includes the specific language of the non-disclosure agreement, the exact payout figure of $80,000, and the date the funds were required to clear escrow. It also includes an addendum signed by Jim guaranteeing the origin of the settlement funds." I pulled the documents toward me and scanned the pages. The legalese was dense, but the figures were unmistakable. The paperwork proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the divorce settlement only required a fraction of the money stolen from my trust. This document destroyed my father's only potential defense. He could never stand in front of a judge and claim the entire $250,000 was absorbed by Bradley's legal crisis. This was the final puzzle piece. I now possessed the altered power of attorney, the bank transfer receipts showing the diverted funds, the public default notices for his commercial properties, and the binding settlement agreement proving the exact cost of the divorce. I had assembled an impenetrable fortress of documentary evidence. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, looking up from the paperwork. "You signed a non-disclosure agreement. Technically, sharing this violates your settlement." Jessica offered a small, fierce smile. "The non-disclosure agreement specifically prevents me from discussing the internal finances of Bradley's contracting firm. It does not prevent me from cooperating with a federal fraud investigation regarding the source of my settlement payout. Your father thought he was buying my silence. He actually just bought his own conviction." She stood up from the booth, slinging her leather tote bag over her shoulder. She looked lighter, as if unburdening herself of the Lawrence family secrets had physically altered her posture. "Do not let him charm his way out of this, Beatrice," she said. "He has spent his entire life talking his way out of consequences. Hold him to the ledger." I thanked her and watched her walk out of the coffee shop, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. I carefully placed the settlement documents into my own briefcase. My father was a man who believed his reputation could bend reality. He believed his booming voice and his country club memberships made him untouchable. I was about to learn that the probate court does not care about your golf handicap. The legal machinery was already in motion. Thomas Wright had informed me that the judge granted our request for an emergency deposition based on the evidence we gathered from the subpoena. My father would be forced to sit in a sterile conference room, raise his right hand, and swear to tell the truth under the penalty of perjury. He would arrive at that deposition expecting a minor family squabble. He would expect me to waver under his stern gaze. He would plan to spin a tale of paternal sacrifice, confident that his lies would hold up against the emotional grievances of a disgruntled daughter. He had no idea I was walking into that room armed with a paper trail that mapped every single one of his sins. The time for serving subpoenas and gathering documents was over. It was time to put him on the record. The conference room at Thomas Wright's firm felt designed to strip away illusions. No mahogany paneling or warm lighting existed here. Just stark white walls, a gray carpet, and a long glass table that offered nowhere to hide your hands. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers hovering over a stenotype machine ready to turn spoken words into permanent legal liabilities. I arrived early, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a tight knot. I took the seat farthest from the door. I arranged my notepad and 2 pens with geometric precision. Today I was not a daughter attending a family meeting. I was a creditor attending the liquidation of a bad debt. My father walked in precisely at 10 o'clock, flanked by a probate attorney who looked visibly stressed. Jim Lawrence, however, wore his confidence like a tailored overcoat. He sported a subtle pinstripe suit and a silk tie, projecting the aura of a man inconvenienced by a minor clerical dispute. For 35 years, he had navigated the world believing that charm could override facts. He smiled warmly at the court reporter, attempted to offer a firm handshake to Thomas, and then looked across the glass table at me. He expected to see the quiet, compliant girl who used to defer to his booming voice. I offered him a blank, unblinking stare. The smile faltered on his lips, replaced by a brief flicker of irritation before he took his seat. The deposition began with standard procedural formalities. The court reporter administered the oath. My father raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He recited the words with practiced ease, entirely unaware that the pledge he just took was the exact mechanism that would destroy him. Thomas Wright opened his leather binder. He did not lead with aggression. He utilized a soft, methodical cadence, asking basic questions about my father's role as the custodian of the Helen Lawrence Trust. "Mr. Lawrence," Thomas said, peering over his reading glasses, "can you explain the circumstances surrounding the October 14th withdrawal of $256,000 from your daughter's trust account?" This was the moment my father had prepared for. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of weary paternal duty. He painted a masterful portrait of a family in crisis. He detailed Bradley's failing marriage, exaggerating the threat Jessica posed to the Lawrence name. He spun a narrative where he was forced to make a difficult, rapid decision to prevent a public scandal that would have ruined his son's contracting firm. "I made a pivot," Jim stated smoothly, his voice resonating in the quiet room. "It was an emergency administrative shift." Bradley was facing a vicious legal battle. His former wife was demanding an extortionate sum of cash to walk away without dragging the business through a messy trial. The trust funds were sitting dormant. I utilized my authority to access those assets, intending to replace them before Beatrice reached her milestone birthday. Thomas turned a page in his binder. "And to clarify for the record, Mr. Lawrence was the entire sum of $256,000 required to satisfy this divorce settlement and the associated legal fees." My father did not hesitate. He believed he controlled the narrative because he assumed Jessica was bound by her non-disclosure agreement, and he believed my mother's willful ignorance shielded him from further scrutiny. He thought the paper trail vanished the moment the money left the estate. "Yes," Jim answered, looking directly at the court reporter to ensure his statement was logged. Every cent was necessary. The settlement demands were steep, and the attorney retainers were exorbitant. The entirety of the withdrawn capital went towards saving my son's business. He had just crossed the threshold. The perjury was officially on the record. I remained perfectly still, channeling my ultimate financial manager persona. A good auditor allows the target to dig the hole as deep as possible before handing them the bill for the shovel. Thomas Wright did not smile, but a cold efficiency settled over his posture. He reached into his binder and extracted a pristine, stapled document. He slid it across the glass table toward my father's attorney. "Let the record reflect I am handing opposing counsel Exhibit A," Thomas announced. "This is the finalized divorce settlement agreement signed by Jessica Lawrence, dated October 16th. Jim's attorney frowned, quickly scanning the pages. My father leaned over his confident facade, beginning to crack as he recognized the document. The color drained from his cheeks. "Mr. Lawrence," Thomas continued, his voice hardening into a sharp instrument. "According to this binding legal contract, the total cash payout required to settle the divorce was exactly $80,000. Furthermore, an addendum bearing your signature explicitly states that this $80,000 originated from your personal retirement savings. Are you now telling this room that the sworn addendum you signed for the family court was a lie?" My father stammered. The booming voice that commanded country club dining rooms evaporated, leaving a thin, frantic rasp. He looked at his lawyer, seeking a lifeline, but his counsel was busy reading the damning paperwork, realizing his client had concealed critical information. "I can explain the discrepancy," Jim sputtered, adjusting his silk tie as if it had suddenly become a noose. There were other fees, unrecorded costs. The situation was fluid. "Let us examine the fluidity of that situation," Thomas interrupted, pulling a second document from his binder. He slid it across the table. "Exhibit B. This is the wire transfer routing history for the remaining $176,000. The records show these funds were deposited directly into a business checking account for Oakmont Holdings LLC on the afternoon of October 16th. The air in the conference room turned to ice. My father stared at the bank ledger, his eyes wide with a terror he could no longer mask. The walls of his carefully constructed reality were collapsing around him in real time. Thomas did not grant him a moment to recover. "Exhibit C," he stated, sliding a third stack of papers forward. "Public default notices and impending foreclosure filings for 3 commercial strip malls owned by Oakmont Holdings. Mr. Lawrence, you are the sole registered agent and managing member of this entity. Is it not true that you used your son's divorce as a smokescreen to embezzle your daughter's inheritance to cover your own catastrophic commercial debt?" Jim Lawrence sat frozen in his chair. The realization of his peril washed over him. He had committed wire fraud, forged a legal document, and now he had committed felony perjury during a sworn deposition. His pristine reputation, his social standing, and his illusion of wealth were obliterated. He was no longer a respected Midwestern patriarch. He was an exposed fraud facing severe criminal and civil liabilities, in a final desperate bid for survival. My father turned his gaze toward me. He abandoned his pride and looked across the glass table, his eyes silently begging for mercy. He wanted the quiet, compliant daughter to step in to halt the proceedings, to offer a compromise that would save him from the abyss. I met his pleading stare with a wall of ice. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting nod. I looked at him with the same detached scrutiny I reserve for a corrupt ledger. He searched my face for a trace of the girl he used to control, and he found nothing but a creditor observing a defunct asset. Thomas Wright closed his leather binder. The sound echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block. "Based on the evidence of gross fiduciary breach, fraud, and perjury," Thomas addressed opposing counsel, "we are formally demanding the immediate liquidation of Jim Lawrence's personal and commercial assets to repay the stolen trust funds, plus accrued interest and legal fees. If we do not receive a comprehensive settlement offer surrendering those assets by tomorrow morning, we will forward this transcript and these exhibits to the county prosecutor." There was no shouting. No theatrical outbursts occurred. The devastating conclusion of my father's reign arrived in the quiet, mundane sound of papers being shuffled into a briefcase. The court reporter stopped typing. Jim's attorney quietly gathered his files, refusing to look at his client. My father sat paralyzed at the glass table, a hollow shell of a man watching his entire empire burn to the ground in under 2 hours. The fallout from the deposition did not occur in a courtroom. It occurred in the grocery store aisles, the country club locker rooms, and the manicured driveways of our Ohio suburb. In a community where social standing is the primary currency, bankruptcy is a quiet tragedy, but fraud is a public execution. The moment Thomas Wright filed the formal demand for the liquidation of my father's assets, the legal documents became public record. In our town, public records are read with the same intense scrutiny as the Sunday morning newspaper. My mother did not wait for a judge to issue a final ruling. She had spent 35 years building her identity around the prestige of being Mrs. Jim Lawrence. She tolerated his booming arrogance because it provided her with a flawless suburban existence. She turned a blind eye to his shifting moods because the luxury vehicles and the charity gala invitations never ceased. When she reviewed the subpoena exhibits and realized the wealth was an illusion, the bargain was broken. When the details of the deposition leaked, proving her husband had committed perjury and stolen from his youngest child to mask his own incompetence, the humiliation became unbearable. 4 days after my father sat in that sterile conference room, a moving truck arrived at the colonial home I grew up in. Susan Lawrence filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone in our zip code knew the true translation of that legal phrase. She packed her designer luggage, abandoned the autumn gala planning committee, and retreated to a rented condominium on the other side of the county. She left Jim to wander the empty halls of a house he could no longer afford to heat. She did not call me to apologize for demanding I accept a 42-year repayment plan. She simply fled the wreckage, desperate to salvage whatever fragments of her social pride remained. With my parents' marriage dissolved and the trust permanently frozen, the collateral damage cascaded downward. Bradley was the next casualty. His residential contracting firm had never been a viable enterprise. It was a vanity project subsidized by stolen inheritance and secured by our father's fading credit. The moment the local supply houses and subcontractors caught wind of Jim's impending financial ruin, the grace periods vanished. The vendors demanded cash on delivery. The commercial lenders who held the notes on Bradley's work trucks called in the debts. Bradley could not turn to the family estate for a swift bailout. He could not beg his father to make a phone call to a sympathetic bank manager. Stripped of the Lawrence family armor, my brother faced the brutal, unyielding friction of the open market. Within 2 weeks, his contracting business plunged into receivership. A court-appointed official seized his remaining assets, padlocked his equipment yard, and began auctioning off his tools to satisfy the angry creditors. Bradley attempted to confront me one final time. He showed up at my townhouse on a rainy Tuesday evening, pounding on the front door, shouting that I had ruined his life. I did not open the door. I watched him through the security camera feed on my phone. He looked small, defeated, and entirely hollow. He kicked the wooden porch railing, slumped onto the concrete steps, and buried his face in his hands. He was waiting for a rescue that was never going to arrive. I turned off the monitor and walked into my kitchen to brew a cup of tea. He lost his company, his wife, and his golden child status in the span of a single autumn. He was finally forced to stand on his own 2 feet, and he immediately collapsed. As the dynasty imploded, my cell phone began to ring. The calls did not come from my immediate family. They came from the extended network of aunts, uncles, and distant cousins who populated the periphery of our family tree. These were the relatives who always attended the lavish Thanksgiving dinners and benefited from the illusion of my father's wealth. They left frantic, breathless voicemails. They accused me of tearing the family apart. They begged me to withdraw the lawsuit, to show mercy, to remember that blood is thicker than a bank ledger. They insisted that Jim was a good man who merely made a terrible mistake under severe pressure. I sat at my polished concrete desk, listening to their pleas through the speakerphone, and I felt nothing but a profound, solemn validation. I did not return a single call. I blocked their numbers one by one. An auditor does not negotiate with the enablers of a corrupt corporation. These relatives had watched my parents coddle Bradley for decades. They had watched my father dismiss my achievements while celebrating my brother's mediocrity. They were perfectly content to enjoy the fruits of a toxic system as long as they were not asked to pay the bill. Now that the bill had arrived, they wanted me to absorb the cost so they could resume their comfortable holidays. They wanted the quiet, responsible daughter to step back into her assigned role. I refused. This is the core truth of what people call revenge. I did not plot to destroy my parents' marriage. I did not conspire to bankrupt my brother's business. I did not plant a bomb inside the Lawrence family foundation. The rot was already there. The rot had been growing for 35 years, fed by arrogance, entitlement, and a desperate need to maintain appearances. My father's fraudulent investments and his staggering hubris were the termites eating away at the structural supports. My mother's willful ignorance was the damp environment that allowed the decay to spread. My brother's incompetence was the heavy burden placed on a failing floor. I was simply the load-bearing wall holding the entire delusion up. They had placed the weight of their secrets, their debts, and their reputations squarely on my shoulders, assuming I would stand firm forever. They assumed I would sacrifice my own future to keep their ceiling from caving in. All I did was step out of the room. I removed my signature. I enforced a boundary. I let the law take its natural course. Once I walked away, I did not have to lift a finger to bring the house down. Gravity did the work for me. The weight of their own lies crushed them. I observed the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my downtown office. The community grapevine shredded the Lawrence name with ruthless efficiency. The family that had defined local prestige was now a cautionary tale whispered over expensive coffees. My father was no longer a respected patriarch. He was a disgraced debtor facing the imminent liquidation of everything he owned. The legal machinery was preparing for the final phase of the extraction. Thomas Wright informed me that the probate judge had reviewed the deposition transcript and the forensic accounting reports. The court was ready to issue a binding judgment. The time for negotiations, threats, and desperate phone calls had expired. The ledger was about to be balanced, and my father was about to learn the exact price of his forgery. The court would not just demand restitution. It would force a sale of the physical monuments of their pride to satisfy the debt. The suburban colonial home, the epicenter of their false kingdom, was firmly in the crosshairs. The final resolution of the legal battle arrived with the sharp strike of a wooden gavel. The probate court convened on a damp Tuesday morning in late January, wrapping up the proceedings with clinical efficiency. The presiding judge had reviewed the deposition transcripts, the forensic accounting ledgers, and the damning divorce settlement documents. In the eyes of the law, the narrative was remarkably straightforward. My father had committed a textbook fiduciary breach, compounded by forgery and perjury. The court did not care about the Lawrence family reputation, nor did it entertain my father's fabricated tales of paternal sacrifice. The judicial system only recognized the unauthorized diversion of capital. The ruling was decisive and comprehensive. The judge ordered Jim Lawrence to make full restitution to my trust account. The judgment included the original principal of $256,000 plus statutory interest calculated from the exact date of the theft. Furthermore, the court mandated that my father cover the entirety of my legal fees, ensuring that my pursuit of justice did not cost me a single cent of my own money. However, securing a judgment is only half the battle. Collecting the debt requires locating liquid assets and my father's shell company. Oakmont Holdings was a wasteland of negative equity. His commercial properties were already deeply underwater and entering foreclosure. He had no cash reserves left to satisfy the court order. To fulfill the restitution mandate, the judge was forced to pierce the corporate veil and target my father's personal holdings. There was only one asset remaining in his portfolio with enough unencumbered equity to cover the debt. The court ordered the immediate forced sale of the Lawrence family home. For over 2 decades, that colonial house had served as the physical anchor of our Midwestern prestige. It was the stage where my mother hosted her charity committee meetings, and the backdrop for my father's carefully curated image of success. The wide brick pathway, the towering oak trees, and the immaculate landscaping were all designed to project an illusion of enduring wealth. Now, the property was stripped of its sentimental value and reduced to a line item on a liquidation schedule. A court-appointed trustee seized control of the deed, stripping my father of his ability to delay or manipulate the transaction. The house would be listed sold, and the proceeds would be distributed directly to my legal counsel to satisfy the judgment. I decided to drive by the property one last time on the afternoon the listing went public. I did not go to gloat. I went to verify that the final phase of the audit was progressing as scheduled. I parked my sedan across the street, letting the engine idle while the heater pushed warm air into the cabin. The sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light over the affluent neighborhood. A white commercial van was parked in the driveway. A real estate agent was pounding a wooden stake into the pristine front lawn, right next to the meticulously trimmed hedges. The sign attached to the post bore the logo of a premier local brokerage, but the red banner stretched across the top communicated the undeniable truth to every passing neighbor. It did not say, coming soon. It said bank-owned liquidation. The ultimate suburban disgrace was now planted firmly in their front yard. As the agent packed his tools and drove away, the front door of the Colonial opened. My father stepped out onto the porch. The physical transformation in Jim Lawrence was jarring. The booming, confident patriarch who used to dominate country club dining rooms was gone. He wore a faded sweater and wrinkled trousers. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his collapsing reality. The color had drained from his complexion, leaving his skin gray and tired. He walked slowly down the brick pathway, stopping a few feet away from the real estate sign. He stared at the wooden post as if it were a gravestone, He noticed my car idling across the street. He hesitated for a brief second, then crossed the asphalt, walking directly toward my driver's side window. I pressed the button to roll the glass down, allowing the crisp winter air to enter the cabin. I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. My father placed his hands on the edge of the window frame, mirroring the exact posture my brother had assumed in the parking garage months earlier. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate panic. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for a trace of the compliant daughter he used to control. "Beatrice, please," he said, his voice reduced to a dry, raspy whisper. "You have proved your point. You won the lawsuit. The judge ruled in your favor, but you have to tell your lawyer to stop the sale. You have to give me more time." I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of detachment. He still believed he could negotiate his way out of a mathematical certainty. "The court ordered the sale, Jim," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "The equity in that house is the only remaining capital available to satisfy the judgment. The process is out of my hands. I will be left with nothing." He pleaded, a genuine tear forming in the corner of his eye. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry. "Your mother took whatever cash she could find when she filed for divorce. The commercial lenders seized the business accounts. If they sell this house, I will be destitute. I will have nowhere to go. I am an old man, Beatrice. You cannot leave your own father on the street." How was deploying his final strategy. Having failed to command me, and having failed to deceive me, he resorted to begging for a bailout. He wanted me to absorb $250,000 loss, simply to spare him the discomfort of facing his own consequences. He expected the old rules of family loyalty to suddenly apply, hoping I would feel responsible for his survival. I let his words hang in the cold air. I thought about the decade he kept that altered power of attorney in his desk, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit my trust. I thought about the dinner table where he confidently offered me a 42-year repayment plan, treating my future like a disposable commodity. "You didn't ask for forgiveness when you signed my name," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of pity. "You don't get to ask for a bailout now that the bill is due." My father flinched as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another excuse, to beg for another chance. I did not give him the opportunity. I rolled the window up, severing the connection. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving Jim Lawrence standing alone in the street, watching his legacy turn to dust in the rearview mirror. I set a permanent, uncrossable boundary, and I never looked back. 2 weeks later, the colonial home sold in an expedited cash transaction. The buyers were a young corporate couple who cared nothing about the Lawrence family history. They simply wanted a good deal on a distressed property in a prime school district. The court-appointed trustee finalized the paperwork, cleared the outstanding mortgage, and isolated the remaining equity. On a quiet Thursday morning, my phone vibrated with a notification from my banking application. The wire transfer had cleared. The screen displayed an incoming deposit of $256,000 alongside a secondary transfer covering my legal expenses. The ledger was finally balanced. The stolen capital had been returned to its rightful owner. I did not leave the money sitting dormant in the account. I had spent my entire life residing in a geographic area defined by toxic expectations and conditional love. I wanted a clean break. I resigned from my position at the wealth management firm in Columbus, packed my belongings, and drove 2 hours north toward the shores of Lake Erie. I used my reclaimed inheritance to place a substantial down payment on a beautiful modern home in a quiet neighborhood outside of Cleveland. The property featured large windows, hardwood floors, and a sweeping view of the water. It was a space entirely unburdened by the ghosts of my past. I walked through the empty rooms, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. I had secured my financial future, and more importantly, I had severed all financial and emotional ties to the toxic system that raised me. I was finally standing in a house built on my own terms, funded by my own resilience. The legal battle was over, but the final accounting of the Lawrence family was still unfolding, and the long-term consequences of their arrogance were just beginning to materialize. 1 year has passed since the wooden gavel fell in the probate court, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of my actual life. I sit on the expansive cedar deck of my new home, wrapping both hands around a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. A crisp, invigorating breeze rolls off Lake Erie, carrying the scent of fresh pine needles and deep, open water. The morning sun breaks through the scattered clouds, glinting off the gentle waves and creating a fractured pattern of bright light that dances across the polished wooden floorboards beneath my feet. On the small glass table beside my chair rests a sleek digital tablet. The screen displays my personal investment portfolios, tracking a steady, honest yield across various diversified funds. Every single number on that illuminated screen belongs exclusively to me. Every decimal point represents my own labor, my own strict discipline, and a boundary fiercely enforced against a lifetime of exploitation. I look at the pristine columns of data and feel a profound, quiet serenity settling into my bones. The frantic, anxious heartbeat of my old existence, the constant suffocating anticipation of the next manufactured family crisis, has faded into a permanent golden silence. The tranquility I enjoy today was purchased by allowing the noise to finally consume the people who created it. I do not actively seek out information regarding the Lawrence family, but in a society built entirely on maintaining reputations, certain updates naturally drift across county lines through the persistent suburban grapevine. My father, Jim Lawrence, currently resides in a cramped, two-bedroom rented apartment in a working-class neighborhood located 3 towns away from the colonial estate he once ruled like a king. His carefully curated social standing evaporated the very moment the forced property liquidation became a matter of public record. The country club revoked his membership for non-payment almost immediately. The local businessmen and municipal leaders who used to seek his counsel on the golf course now cross the street to avoid making eye contact outside the hardware store. But social exile is only a fraction of his current dismal reality. When the commercial real estate shell company fails spectacularly under a cloud of suspected fraud, the federal government tends to notice. The Internal Revenue Service initiated a comprehensive, relentless audit of Oakmont Holdings and every subsidiary tied to his name. He spends his days sitting at a tiny laminate dining table, drowning in complex tax forms, severe penalty notices and mounting legal fees he cannot afford to pay. He can no longer rely on a booming voice and a tailored suit to intimidate a room into compliance. The federal tax auditors do not care about his former local prestige. They only care about the ledger, and his ledger is permanently broken. He traded his daughter to buy himself a few more months of a comfortable illusion, and the final invoice cost him his entire identity. My mother did not fare much better, though her steep descent took a slightly different trajectory. When the divorce finalized, Susan discovered the harsh, unyielding arithmetic of dividing negative equity. The illusion of vast wealth she had clung to for 35 years dissolved overnight, leaving her with a fraction of the comfort she felt entitled to possess. Unable to endure the pitying stares and the hushed, cruel whispers of her former charity committee peers at the grocery store, she packed her remaining belongings and relocated to a small rural town near the Indiana border to escape the suffocating gossip. To make ends meet and pay her basic utility bills, she secured employment as a sales associate at a high-end retail boutique. For decades, she defined her worth by the designer labels she purchased and the lavish holiday parties she hosted. Now, she spends her long afternoons steaming silk blouses and folding cashmere sweaters for affluent women who live the exact life she lost. She traded her independence and her relationship with her daughter to exist under the protective umbrella of a powerful patriarch, willfully ignoring the dark storm clouds gathering right above them. When the umbrella finally collapsed, she had no shelter left. She remains trapped in a quiet prison of her own making, forever mourning a social status that was funded by deceit. Bradley remains exactly where I left him, trapped in a perpetual cycle of unearned entitlement and chronic stagnation. His residential contracting firm was liquidated by the court-appointed receiver to pay a fraction of his outstanding debts to angry vendors. He currently works as an hourly supervisor for a commercial construction crew, a manual labor position he openly despises. He still lacks the capacity for basic introspection. According to the few mutual acquaintances who still tolerate his phone calls, he blames the shifting economy for his business failure. He blames his ex-wife Jessica for initiating the divorce. He blames me for freezing the trust and cutting off his credit line. He blames our father for hiding the commercial debt. He blames everyone in the world except the man staring back at him in the mirror. He was the golden child raised from birth to believe the universe would always pave a smooth, obstacle-free road ahead of him. Stripped of his gold, he is just an ordinary bitter man, resentful of the dirt beneath his heavy work boots. I observe their respective fates, not with a sense of vindictive joy, but with the solemn, quiet validation of a financial manager, reviewing a closed, resolved account. They are simply facing the natural, inevitable consequences of their own arithmetic. I did not destroy their lives. I merely stopped subsidizing their dysfunction. The truest form of fluffy revenge is not found in orchestrating a dramatic downfall. It is found in the simple, profound act of walking away and building a beautiful, secure life in the total absence of their toxicity. I broke a generational curse that dictated silent female suffering was a mandatory expected payment for male convenience. I refused to let my financial future become collateral damage in a desperate campaign to protect a fragile patriarchal ego. I drew a firm line in the sand, and I reinforced that boundary with solid concrete. If you are listening to this story, and you find yourself constantly pouring your own hard-earned resources into a family system that never yields a return, let this be your final official notice. You are allowed to stop paying the bill. You are allowed to audit the relationships in your life. True family does not forge your signature to save their own pride. Love that requires you to bankrupt your financial or emotional future to keep the peace is not love at all. It is exploitation wearing a familiar, comfortable mask. You owe them nothing, and you owe yourself a future of your own making. I raise my ceramic mug to my lips, taking a slow, satisfying sip of the dark, warm coffee. The morning air is sharp, clean, and full of promise. The ledger is finally balanced and the conflict is permanently closed.
We often speak of the American dream as if it is a tangible destination, a colonial house with a manicured lawn, a respectable career, and a family portrait where everyone is smiling effortlessly. But in the quiet, affluent suburbs of this country, that dream sometimes twists into a heavy, suffocating performance. We watch the Lawrence family meticulously curate their pristine image, trading their own flesh and blood to keep the facade from cracking. It is a cautionary tale that echoes through generations, forcing us to look at our own reflections in the polished glass of societal expectations. The collapse of the Lawrence dynasty was not just a legal defeat, it was a profound spiritual bankruptcy. It forces us to ask what it truly means to guide a child to shoulder family responsibility and to parent with a conscience in a culture obsessed with status. There is a specific kind of blindness that infects traditional family structures, a delusion where the applause of neighbors drowns out the quiet weeping of a neglected child. We call it saving face, but it is in reality a profound lack of wisdom. Jim and Susan Lawrence sacrificed their daughter's financial security, her trust, and ultimately their own moral compass just to maintain a fictional narrative for the country club and the local zoning board. As parents, the pressure to appear flawless can be overwhelming. We want our children to be reflections of our own success. Yet true parenting wisdom requires looking past the superficial veneer of wealth and reputation. It demands that we see our children for who they actually are, loving them, not for the accolades they bring to our doorstep, but for the inherent value of their character. When we allow our egos and the fear of societal judgment to dictate how we manage our homes, we do not protect our families. We build their prisons. Reputation is merely a coat you wear. Eventually, the weather changes and you are left shivering if there is no substance underneath. The foundation of any enduring family is not the inheritance left behind in a trust fund, but the strict, unyielding application of fairness and truth. The Lawrences violated the most sacred moral contract of parenting by institutionalizing deceit and blatant favoritism. They shielded their golden son Bradley from his own failures while systematically harvesting the independence of their daughter Beatrice. This is a distorted value system that plagues many households. We tell ourselves that covering up a child's mistakes is an act of love. But when that love requires the exploitation of another sibling, it ceases to be affection and morphs into profound selfishness. Parenting requires the courage to face ugly truths. It requires the integrity to admit fault, to enforce boundaries equitably, and to never use the sacred concept of family loyalty as a weapon to manipulate a child into an unjust sacrifice. A home must be the one place where truth is revered above comfort. If a family's unity is built on a foundation of lies, it is only a matter of time before a simple ledger brings the entire house down. Perhaps the greatest tragedy in the Lawrence household was not the money stolen from Beatrice, but the resilience stolen from Bradley. In their desperate bid to pave a frictionless road for their son, Jim and Susan robbed him of the essential friction required for growth. By constantly swooping in with checkbooks and influence to rescue him from his underbid contracts and his messy divorce, they transformed him into a fragile, dependent man, entirely incapable of standing on his own. In American culture, we often feel immense pressure to ensure our children never struggle to guarantee they have a life that lacks for nothing. Yet the hardest and most loving lesson a parent must learn is the art of stepping back. True love is not laying down a carpet of roses. It is equipping a child with the strength to walk on gravel. Taking away a child's opportunity to suffer the consequences of their own actions is taking away their right to mature. The pain of falling is the exact catalyst needed to forge grit, independence, and accountability. Without it, they are simply waiting for a rescue that will eventually run out of funds. To break these toxic cycles, we must turn our gaze inward. The modern world spins at a dizzying pace, pulling us into a relentless vortex of materialism and competition. To forge a better life and guide our children with genuine grace, we have to practice the difficult art of self-cultivation. We must relinquish the desperate need for control, recognizing that our children are not our property, nor are they tools to fulfill our abandoned dreams. It requires a daily practice of emotional awareness, identifying our own deeply rooted traumas, our biases, and our greed, and doing the hard work to heal them before we pass them down to the next generation. A true family is not sustained by forged signatures, forced holiday dinners, or blank checks. It is nourished by unconditional love, a deep respect for personal boundaries, and boundless compassion. When we fix the rot within ourselves, the home naturally becomes a sanctuary of peace, rather than a battlefield of hidden debts and performative affection. If this reflection resonated with the quiet struggles in your own life, or if you have ever felt the crushing weight of trying to balance family loyalty against your own survival, you are not alone. Please consider subscribing to Fluffy Revenge, where we continue to explore the complex, often hidden dynamics of family life, empowering you to find your voice and enforce your boundaries. We spend our entire lives carefully constructing the houses we live in, painting the walls, manicuring the lawns, and ensuring the front door looks immaculate to the passing street. But when the lights go out and the neighborhood falls dead silent, the house must stand on its own framing. You can hide the cracks from the neighbors for a lifetime, but eventually, the foundation always remembers the exact weight of the truth.